Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Bob Silverman, the president of the American Foreign Service Association. On behalf of AFSA, we're extremely pleased to host another event together with the Public Diplomacy Alumni Association, which is I can call it a sister organization that works very well with us. And for this afternoon, we have with us the former Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, P.J. Crowley. And so we're all very pleased that he is here. Thank you. Let me mention two other upcoming events at AFSA, right here in this room. Next week we have a showing of a documentary film about Syria called Return to Homes. And one of the producers of that film will be here. So next Tuesday at 5 p.m. And an issue of deep concern to all of us is what's the situation going on there in Syria. This film will be part of the DC Film Festival later, but you can see it here first at AFSA. 2 weeks from now, we have a book talk by Ambassador retired Larry Pope called The Demilitarization of American Diplomacy. So that will be an interesting topic, and those of us who know Larry know that it'll be very fiery and interesting. So with no further ado, let me introduce the Vice President of PDAA, Joe O'Connell, who will introduce our speaker. And thank you very much, Joe.
Good afternoon, Bob. Thank you very much, and thank all of your colleagues. It's a delight to work with. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Public Diplomacy Alumni Association, I want to welcome everybody, as well as our viewers on C-SPAN. And thanks to them for coming over. We're delighted to be working with the American Foreign Service Association, co-sponsoring today's remarks by P.J. Crowley. This is our second collaboration with AFSA. We look forward to many more, as Bob said, in the months and years, I hope, ahead. Although the expression needs no introduction is often overused, it applies, especially in these precincts, to P.J. Crowley perfectly. We all grew accustomed to seeing P.J. at the podium of the State Department press room when he was Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs and Department spokesman between 2009 and 2011. During those years, he was the principal U.S. government interlocutor regarding the impact of the release of classified diplomatic cables to WikiLeaks, among many other thorny issues at that time. These days, PJ's podium is in the classrooms at nearby GW University, where he's professor of practice and a fellow at GW's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. There, he shares his experience and insights with students in his teaching of public diplomacy and crisis communications. PJ also appears frequently as a national security commentator on national and global television networks, including a regular gig at the BBC. This afternoon, PJ will discuss what he has called the U.S. public diplomacy deficit, a most timely topic in light of the momentous events occurring right now in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere around the world. Afterwards, PJ will be very happy, he tells us, to take your questions and comments. Welcome, PJ, to this microphone.
Unaccustomed as I am to taking questions from Joe, Bob, thank you very, very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and to see a number of colleagues, past and present, in the audience. I do want to recognize a couple in particular. Jonathan Henoch over here is an outstanding Foreign Service officer and serving as the Public Diplomacy Officer in Residence at the IPDGC, Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, at GW. Later in the year, he'll be off to Ankara, Turkey, one of the most interesting places in the world for practitioners of public diplomacy. We are doing an analysis of Turkey's public diplomacy challenge at GW that we'll be releasing later in the year. And second, Bruce Gregory, also a colleague at GW, who's just released an important and thought-provoking report on the future of public diplomacy that's available on our IPDGC website. It's an important contribution to the debate about public diplomacy, what it is, what it isn't, what it was supposed to become, and hasn't yet. I came to understand this debate early in my tenure as Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, and It appears to be a debate that never ends. In fact, as soon as you start the debate, you're drawn back in time, not focused on what was, not necessarily what needs to be. But when I arrived across the street, I visited every nook and cranny in my organization. One particular group, some veterans who have been a part of USIA, and has, we shall say, had not moved on. And I said, guys, it's been 10 years. Get over it. And their response was, we're never getting over it. That group notwithstanding, the debate itself is useful and important. Now, if you look at the title of my remarks, the public diplomacy deficit, I'm not sure whether I thought of that or you thought of that. It's a great title for a speech. But you might think the deficit includes the lack of an entity like USIA. Well, I'm going to disappoint you. The challenge of public diplomacy in the 21st century is fundamentally different than what we experienced during the Cold War. Even to talk about the current crisis in Ukraine, and you hear that this is a new Cold War. Now, I believe the department is doing very effective public diplomacy work over the past several months. The United States has had no trouble communicating. Victoria Nuland, our good friend and colleague in particular, thanks to the Russian intelligence services. But the policy world and information environment are very different than they were 40 years ago when I entered government service. Heck, the world changed dramatically just at the time from when I left the White House in 2001. So I came to the State Department in 2009. The challenge in today's world is not just about what we communicate about who we are. We're actually very good at that. But we need to do better at explaining what we do and factoring public diplomacy and public opinion into the policy-making process. This is where I believe the public diplomacy deficit exists. Now, the new Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Rick Stengel, talked yesterday at a swearing-in ceremony about the power of the story that we tell. Our standing in the world is challenged in some respects, but make no mistake, as Rick said, when you put everything together, who we are, what we stand for, what we produce, how we innovate, the opportunities we generate for our citizens and others, the ideas that have come to define us, we are admired for who we are. But the world does not like, and in many cases does not understand what we are trying to do. Too often there's a gap between our global narrative and our actions. Closing that gap is vitally important. Now, this poses a bit of a paradox. I do not believe that the United States has trouble communicating. I never believed that we were out-communicated by a guy in a cave. Well, as it turns out, he wasn't in a cave. And as it turns out, he was struggling to lead a far-flung movement that also failed to recognize what its actions were communicating to key communities from which it derives support. Again, go back to 2011 when I was across the street. After mentioning at the podium that we were waiting to hear from the Libyan government regarding the official status of its ambassador, he had defected, then Foreign Minister Musa Kusa called my colleague Jeff Feltman and said, "Mr. Crowley says you're waiting to hear from me." And then he never mentioned the ambassador. More recently, Secretary Kerry made an off-the-cuff comment regarding Syria that Russia heard loud and clear. The comment was converted into the removal of chemical weapons from the Syrian battlefield. Now, Syria remains a horrific tragedy, but at least weapons of mass destruction are no longer part of the equation. But too often over the past decade, we have failed to recognize the impact of what we do. Chosen not to explain our action or preferred to communicate in private, not public. How many times have we heard, we can't talk about that, it might tip off our adversaries. But in the process, we end up not explaining ourselves effectively to our friends and even our own citizens. The world is changing dramatically. I don't need to tell an audience like this that fact. And so must our strategies for policymaking, diplomacy, and public diplomacy. Now, I'm having fun being a professor. It's a lot more fun to be a professor than trying to explain U.S. policy across the street. But at the start of the semester, I posed a series of questions to my graduate class in public diplomacy at GW. first one was, does public diplomacy require fundamental change in the 21st century? Its foundations and, to some extent, its current functions remain rooted in the Cold War world. Back then, it was two distinct systems competing for global primacy. Today, we still confront, as the President said in his recent trip to Europe, a contest of ideas. But this contest is very different. There are many more competitors, states and non-state actors, jockeying for influence in an integrated global system. Now, back then, you could send distinct messages, information and disinformation, to different audiences and be reasonably confident the two would never find themselves in the same room. Now, anything that we say is available within minutes almost anywhere in the world. There's no such thing as a foreign-domestic divide. The concept of plausible deniability is rapidly becoming obsolete, although that may be news to Russia and Vladimir Putin. Now, a second question I posed to my students was, if public diplomacy needs to adapt, should the majority of effort and resources be devoted to programs with a long-term or a short-term payoff? Now, no one doubts the strategic value of Fulbright scholarships, for example. I don't think it's an overstatement to say in the 100-year process or evolution of what has become known as public diplomacy, no single program has been more influential or yielded a better or higher ROI, return on investment, than Fulbright scholarships. We do need to preserve cultural, educational, and exchange programs that produce such demonstrated long-term benefits. But we have to step back and ask some tough questions. Do we need to achieve understanding and influence everywhere? After all, we're the only country in the world that seemingly has a diplomatic presence and a policy interest that one way or another affects every square inch of Europe. When our policy allegedly pivots from one part of the world to another, say to Asia, do public diplomacy resources have to pivot as well? And what are we trying to achieve with these investments? A benefit of the doubt? Attraction? Does attraction translate into influence? All good questions without easy answers. But no doubt a meaningful slice of the public diplomacy pie should be devoted to long-term efforts that are not trumped by the immediate. Now, there is tension in the dual nature of public diplomacy today, the need to focus on the long term even as we deal with the crisis of the moment. But we can do both. A third question I posed regarded the importance of public opinion as a factor in the policy-making process. As the most influential country in the world, we're always going to say things and do things that someone is not going to like. At times, to the occasional consternation of my policy colleagues, I would welcome and seek out public disagreements with world leaders. The late Hugo Chavez called me ridiculous by name on his weekly television show, Il Presidente. It's one of the highlights of my time across the street. Now, my policy colleagues said, ignore him. But I argued that there was a significant regional debate already underway. The question was simply, are we going to join that debate? On a local, regional, or global basis, we've always welcomed debates. And far more often than not, these debates have advanced our interests, policies, and values. In my view, we should never shy away from them. Public opinion today is becoming more strategic. It's not to say that we're out to win a popularity contest. Foreign policy is still guided significantly by elite public opinion, which the United States government has always successfully cultivated. But as we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years, we cannot ignore domestic and global public opinion. Whether dealing with a prime minister or president for life, neither of us can take street sentiment for granted. Fareed Zakaria calls his program GPS, Public Global Square. He does so for a good reason. The world now has access to a wider array of information than ever before. More and more of the world is connected. The most potent weapon in our arsenal today is a cell phone, a smartphone. connected to the internet and with a very good camera. The impact of social media has been understood. Perhaps it has even been overstated, but it is an increasingly powerful tool for policy and social actors. What we saw 3 years ago with the Arab uprisings were real revolutions. They were not Facebook, Twitter, or Wiki revolutions. Particularly in Egypt, our organized labor played a vitally important role. So did networks like the April 6 movement. But they were enabled by an information infrastructure in Egypt that could not be cut off, despite government attempts to do so. In Syria, the opposition is struggling, not because it's out-connected, but at least for the moment, it's outgunned. That said, we saw the power of social media last summer when countless reports using YouTube and other channels advanced credible evidence that chemical weapons were being used on a large scale, which forced the United Nations and major powers, including the United States and Russia, to respond. That said, the documentation of atrocities in Syria through all forms of media has not translated into a groundswell of public support for a more activist or interventionist policy. But the so-called CNN, Al Jazeera, or Facebook effects are real. They have an agenda-setting role. They have the ability to mobilize public opinion around a specific cause, at least for a limited period of time. They can change the status quo. They can impose real constraints and real costs on policies that are unpopular, even if they are not in and of themselves deterministic. They are a force in the 21st century policy environment that is vitally important. Now, if that is the case, what about the fourth question I posed to my students? What is the relationship between diplomacy and public diplomacy? During the Cold War, they were separate functions, particularly structurally, given the distinct existences of the Department of State and the United States Information Agency. For the past 15 years, they've been related functions with the integration of the two agencies in 1999. Now, I don't think anyone in this room would suggest that the integration that was envisioned back then has been complete. It remains very much a work in progress. Now, my class decided, broadly speaking, that in today's policy environment, brace yourself, the two are actually synonymous. In a global and interconnected world, diplomacy is no longer just a province of government-to-government dialogue behind closed doors. Diplomacy in today's world is necessarily public. Think back to my time in a couple of instances. Frank Wisner, a guy that we all know and love, took a sensitive diplomatic trip to Cairo in 2011 to see Hosni Mubarak shortly before he was forced into retirement. Frank never made it to the American embassy, much less to see Mubarak before being pictured on the sidewalk near his hotel. Just in the last few days, John Brennan was outed this past weekend when he made a side trip to Ukraine during a scheduled European travel. Whatever we do is going to be defined by someone. It might as well be us. And I think the State Department was right over the weekend to acknowledge Brennan's trip, something that the CIA does not normally do. I mentioned earlier a report by my colleague Bruce Gregory. He suggested in his report that public diplomacy is no longer distinct from diplomacy. It is now more appropriate to speak of the public dimension of diplomacy in a world in which events seem to be accelerating, where the actions and statements of governments are more visible and frequently subject to intense public scrutiny, where no country or no entity can enact realistic solutions to challenges alone. But where gaining political consensus for action is more and more difficult. And thus, where effective diplomacy requires not just an understanding of the substance, but also the competing national interests, clashes of history and cultures and complex politics of any issue. Let's look at a few examples. But let's pause for 1 second. Take Ukraine, for example. The Obama administration, I think, is playing a limited hand in Ukraine quite effectively. There is an imbalance of interests in this challenge. country is far more important to Russia's national interest than America's or Europe's. But the United States and Europe have continued to offer close relations to countries that define themselves in terms of what they are for and not just what they are against. I'm intrigued by the revisionism that has crept into the debate about Ukraine, that Europe and the United States have overreached when extending EU or NATO membership to countries in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. Really? Tell that to Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, or the Baltic states, who have never doubted the importance of political, economic, and security alliances. The last 6 months have done more to remind populations in the West about the importance of friendships and alliances than 2 decades of political hectoring about diminishing defense budgets. The United States and Europe have been clear, firm, and patient about what's at stake, how the crisis can be solved, and the consequences of ongoing Russian intimidation, infiltration, and manipulation. The President has been very careful to keep the rhetoric measured and the door open to a diplomatic solution. We certainly hope that John Kerry will be successful this week in his discussions in Geneva. This resolve, but this restraint, I think has helped for the United States to regain influence that it lost in recent years. And as for Vladimir Putin, whatever his short-term political or even territorial gains, he stands to be, I think, the loser over the long run. That $50 billion investment in the Sochi Olympics may have bought him some domestic. That we need to do a better job of aligning actions and words. I do not for a minute suggest that this is easy. Take Egypt. In the immediate aftermath of the military intervention that overthrew President Morsi, the United States declined to say whether or not it was a military coup. It was, although not your garden variety. After all, it was and remains popular with a majority of Egyptian citizens. The U.S. meta-narrative regarding Egypt, the political center of the Arab world, was governments must respond to the aspirations of its people. I said that, I tweeted that, consistently in early 2011. And on the surface, it would appear that Egypt's military leader, and soon to be its new president, General al-Sisi, is doing just that. And by not calling it a coup, the United States avoided the legal requirement to suspend all military assistance to Egypt and retain the presumed leverage that goes with $1.5 billion in aid. But as subsequent events have shown, the United States' unwillingness to declare Egyptian military action a coup has dramatically undermined the American democracy narrative in the Middle East. To be sure, President Morsi, while elected freely and fairly, was not governing effectively or democratically. But there was also little reason to believe that the Egyptian military was going to be a democratic agent of change. Subsequent actions have all but rolled back not just the 2012 election, but the 2011 revolution as well. The leaders of the April 6 movement have been given 3-year jail sentences, just upheld by an appeals court. Journalists from Al Jazeera, whose broadcasts in 2011 provided reach and staying power to the Tahrir movement, have been arrested. Now, notwithstanding American aspirations, there's no reason to believe that Egypt is on a path to an inclusive democracy. And this has all the makings of a no-win. The United States is simultaneously accused of doing too much and not doing enough. We are accused of defending Morsi and condoning his overthrow. But the failure to take a position has been no panacea either. One recent poll showed the United States has a 4% approval rating in Egypt, within the margin of error. It makes it possible that we have offended literally every man, woman, and child in the country. We backed the removal of a benign dictator in 2011 to be on the right side of history. But what we've seen is that history is not static. And when push came to shove, we cast our lot with another military strongman rather than an elected leader. I'm not saying that's a great choice, but this was a lesson that we thought we learned in the aftermath of 9/11. and we still have to relearn. The key question is to what extent public diplomacy or the public dimension of diplomacy factored into the decision to maintain the military dimension of the relationship, as important as that is. Every indication is that the answer was public diplomacy played a marginal role at best, which again underscores the ongoing challenge of integration of public diplomacy within the inner workings of the Department of State. Take another case study, the recent and avoidable crisis over the arrest of an Indian diplomat for visa fraud, and from India's standpoint, her alleged mistreatment while in custody. The United States has a right to defend its laws, and there is strong evidence that Devyani Khobragade consciously worked to deceive the United States regarding her adherence to our visa laws. The case was the third such incident where Indian diplomats were accused of mistreatment of their domestic employees. India's tit-for-tat response, particularly the removal of security barriers around the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, undermines India's narrative as a rising power committed to upholding international norms. Now, this is not to point fingers at any specific decision over the past 9 months, but the question again is, where was the application of sound public diplomacy practice to resolve the situation before it became a crisis? Or, once the decision was made to proceed with a legal case, to employ public diplomacy resources to define what the case was about and what it was not about. Again, by every indication, those on the public diplomacy and public affairs side of the House were either not consulted in a meaningful way, or perhaps did not even know about the case until Khobragade was turned over to the U.S. Marshals Service by diplomatic security. Effective diplomacy on both sides eventually moved our countries beyond the crisis stage, but not before considerable damage was done to what President Obama has termed one of the defining relationships of the 21st century. Now, the question is whether, as part of the policy process, diplomatic costs are weighed alongside the strategic benefits of an action or a non-action, and where there is a likely recognition of potential public costs are steps taken to potentially mitigate the impact. Take Pakistan, for example. The United States is never going to gain the trust and confidence of a majority of Pakistani citizens, at least not while the United States tries to maintain a constructive relationship with India. As Hussein Haqqani, the former Pakistani ambassador to the United States, has written in an excellent book about the history of U.S.-Pakistani relations, the relationship has a long history of misconceptions and dysfunction on both sides. Now, in the most recent public opinion polls in Pakistan, roughly 2/3 of Pakistani consider the United States an enemy. This is a potential strategic problem in a context of what was once considered the war on terror, now aptly renamed the war against Al-Qaeda. We have said for a long time that there is no kinetic solution to the challenge of violent political extremism. Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld appropriately questioned in a so-called snowflake in 2003 whether the U.S. strategy was creating more extremists than it was eliminating. That remains a fundamental question. Faisal Shahzad, who attempted to set off a bomb in Times Square in 2010, was apparently motivated by ongoing drone operations in Pakistan. Now, those drone operations have been instrumental in reducing the threat posed by core Al-Qaeda, of course, along with the death of Osama bin Laden. To be clear, the threat has not disappeared, but represents a danger that can be effectively managed at a reduced level of effort. But what we continue to do in Pakistan comes at a very high cost. From a policy standpoint, it appears the Obama administration, notwithstanding the President's pledges to increase transparency of drone operations, has respected an arrangement struck between the Bush administration and the Musharraf government that neither country would talk publicly about drone operations in Pakistan. The United States treats drone operations as a secret, but whatever we choose to call them, they're not invisible. The media provides regular updates on drone operations, and a number of organizations, including the Bureau of Investigative Journalists and the New America Foundation, catalog their effectiveness and impact. All the supposed secrecy accomplishes is enabling Pakistan to mislead its own people about what it knows about drone operations and the fact that they are in Pakistan's interest as well as America's. And it enables Pakistan to say to its own people that their drones are a violation of Pakistani sovereignty, which they are not. The secrecy surrounding drone operations denies the United States the use of public diplomacy tools to raise understanding and lower the costs of what is being done in this theater of operations. This doesn't mean that we should change what we're doing. We have to factor the diplomatic costs into these kinds of decisions as we look to the future. After all, when the United States ends the war in Afghanistan later this year, the American people still need to understand that their technology will remain at war, even if the Army is not. Our policymakers used to make sure that they need to make sure that policy and security benefits outweigh the public diplomacy costs. Today, when we talk about foreign policy and public diplomacy, we recognize it as a whole of government challenge. Day in and day out, the State Department is still a leading actor when it comes to policy development and the execution of foreign policy, but is not necessarily the dominant player it once was. Obviously, the Defense Department, with its global presence and its healthy budget, has a major role to play as well. Much of our global dialogue today is about economic issues, and as we've seen in a variety of crises, and of course particularly Iran, sanctions have become the coercive tool of choice, which gives a major international diplomatic role to the Treasury Department. One of the major advances of the last dozen years since 9/11 has been the increased international cooperation with combating terrorism and violent political extremism. The State Department has a role to play, but so does the Justice Department, the FBI, the intelligence services, and now the Department of Homeland Security. Put this all together at an overseas diplomatic mission, and it creates a vast array of issues and responsibilities for a U.S. ambassador and his or her country team. No wonder former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called for the transformation in the way that we structure and command our embassies around the world. Now, in this environment, public diplomacy has to continue to adapt as well. Now, in many respects, public diplomacy has arguably undergone the most profound transformation already of any foreign policy element over the past 15 years. At the same time, it seems that the public diplomacy community faces the very same challenge it did 15 years ago. Nick Cull of the University of Southern California, in his excellent history of USIA, said, with a couple of exceptions, USIA was always kept at arm's length when it came to the policymaking process. I think the good news, if we look at the integration of public diplomacy into the Department of State, is that PD is now represented at the policy table, but does not yet have the influential voice that is required. Public diplomacy is not just about creating a constructive environment for the advancement of American policy and national interest. It's not just about an enabling function for diplomacy, but an essential element of diplomatic practice. This does not require, in my view, a change of bureaucracy, but perhaps a change in process. Now, like it or not, the nexus for the development and execution of, or the development anyway, of foreign policy has shifted to the White House. This is a domestic and international political reality, and I've served in all three places, the Defense Department, the State Department, and the National Security Council. And there is at the NSC today an Office of Global Engagement. It's not particularly large, it's not particularly influential. In other words, just as it was, go back 15 years and beyond, public diplomacy is underrepresented in the Situation Room, just as it was in the Truman administration. There is a public diplomacy interagency working group. It needs to be strengthened and charged with advising the policy deputies and principals regarding the public diplomacy implications of all major foreign policy decisions. As a general rule today, certainly in my time in government, public diplomacy is a major consideration after a policy decision, but not before. This is what needs to change. Now, the world is becoming more transparent, whether we, and that's true whether or not you consider the implications of the works of Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden. Responding effectively to the Snowden revelations has been a distinct challenge since it seems to be unfolding in slow motion. The United States government is not certain what Snowden took with him and how much of this material now rests in the hands of outlets like The Guardian and The Washington Post, both of whom earned Pulitzer Prizes this week. The impact of WikiLeaks was far less than we feared, expressly because of the aggressive political response led by Secretary Clinton, Deputy Secretary Bill Burns, the regional assistant secretaries, and the fine work of our ambassadors in the field. But in government today, we still operate on the assumption that whether or not an action becomes public is a matter of choice or chance. Now it's a matter of near certainty. We need to adapt to that reality. The bin Laden raid was secret. It was not invisible. And just as we are a safer world today because of his demise, we are still experiencing profound diplomatic impact from the ripple effects of that action. Take, for example, the implications of the use of Dr. Shakil Afridi as part of the effort to understand what was going on inside the Abbottabad compound. That has profoundly affected regional perceptions about public health initiatives that are in everybody's interest, including the Pakistani people. This is not to say that pulling out all the stops to get bin Laden was wrong. However, we have to operate today under the assumption that what we do will become known, and develop a strategy to deal with and explain those difficult choices and where those choices have to be made to try to mitigate those effects. And if the impact of a potential action is too severe, it's necessary to go back to the drawing board and choose another option. Even in the most secret compartments of our government today, just as we have lawyers in these classified settings to evaluate the legal implications of actions being contemplated, we need to have public diplomacy experts at that same table to judge what the impact of an action will be and ensure that policy and operational benefits outweigh the public consequences of our actions. Now, given the expanding reach of both traditional and social media, public opinion is becoming more important in the conduct of foreign policy. And that public opinion is a matter of our domestic policy as well as those overseas. This is a global stage, and more people have front row seats. What was true when we, as we conceptualize the conflict that we experienced over the past dozen years, what was true in conflict, it equally applies to areas where we are not. Policy and public diplomacy today is about people, no longer just leaders and elites, but broad populations as well, protecting them, engaging them, understanding their history, their culture, their politics, what they think about the United States, and what they expect from the United States. Our ability to pursue our national interests will increasingly require international cooperation, understanding, and support. To achieve that, the United States will have to be seen as acting credibly and legitimately. We are competing in a world of narratives, just as we did during the Cold War, but now there are more narratives than just two. There are many, and we need to do a better job of connecting what we say and what we do as part of that broader strategic narrative. As Joe Nye says in The Future of Power, in the 21st century, in this competitive environment, the player with the best story will ultimately win. And as Rick Stengel said yesterday, and rightly, we do have a great story to tell. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, PJ. Let me open the floor to any and all questions, and starting with Mike. And we have a microphone here, if you'd like.
Perhaps we can.
A quick question. Do you approve of the USAID support for regime change in Cuba? Is that the right way to go about what many would say is an estimable goal?
Do I support the goal of regime change in Cuba?
USAID.
Well, regime change in Cuba has been the United States policy for 60 years. I think do we support using social media tools, to try to open up Cuban society? Absolutely. I was there at the State Department, when the AID contractor Alan Gross was apprehended in Cuba, and we continue to urge his release and return to his family. One of the more interesting and relatively unknown actions or ongoing efforts within the State Department is through DRL and the cautious but definite use of circumvention technology to try to open up spaces. I mean, this is a losing battle. I mean, you take a country like China, and the efforts that they try to control the flow of information. I was in Beijing last May, and the two things that you couldn't do, you couldn't tweet, because they were afraid that you tweet Tiananmen Square, and you couldn't read the New York Times, because of the ongoing Times coverage of the princelings and the corruption that China is in fact understanding as a threat to their political legitimacy. So I mean, this is an ongoing challenge, but I absolutely think that it is proper for the United States to use to try to find a way to introduce technologies into societies that are currently closed, and I think trying to control what their populations know about what happened in the rest of the world. I don't think we should be shy about that. I don't think Raj Shah was shy when he was talking to Congress last week.
Other questions? Please. Oh, sorry,
Yes, I believe you said that PD is now at the foreign policy making table, but it still doesn't have any real influence. What, in practical terms, could PD get that influence?
Well, under Judith McHale, and perhaps before her, I know the idea was developed under Jim Glassman that you have the public diplomacy deputy assistant secretaries, and they are in the regional bureaus as policy is being developed. It's unclear whether they're in the key meetings yet. The real meetings were at crunch time where they hit. I mean, go back to what I said about the interagency working group on public diplomacy. As soon as I arrived, I had an early meeting over at one of the situation rooms, and I said, hey, we meet periodically, but we talk about the tools of communication, the channels that are available to us. We're not talking about the public diplomacy dimension of the issues that the deputies are wrestling with and teeing up for the principals and the president. I said, why don't we have a policy, an interagency policy meeting that then feeds a perspective into what the deputies should think about in terms of public diplomacy as they're wrestling with option A, option B, option C, recognizing that anytime it gets to the deputies or particular principals, all the good ideas or all the good options are gone. We're talking about what's the least bad. And they looked at me like I had two heads. Really? The public diplomat in chief in the government today is Ben Rhodes. He's a magnificent, thoughtful person. He's also doing 100,000 things at the same time. But there's just not yet a public diplomacy process that feeds into the policy-making process that is organized or structured. It's all ad hoc, and I think that's something that we just need to develop. So I think strengthening the role of the PD, Deputy Assistant Secretaries, I think is an important step in this process.
Mr. Crowley, thank you. I'd like to hear your opinions on the White House's current messaging with regards to the ever-strengthening and aggressive sanctions against Russia, and how you feel the White House is either addressing or not addressing the comments in the media which specifically hit on the fact that those sanctions reduce U.S. business involvement in Russia and thereby decrease our possible leverage in the future.
I actually think, and as I said in my remarks, I think so far the White House has been pretty effective. I mean, in the sense that we haven't let rhetoric get ahead of what we believe we're actually capable of doing. And the president's been clear, you know, there will be costs. Now, obviously, we've got to produce those costs, and I don't think that Vladimir Putin can overlook when $60 billion in international capital leaves Russia in this quarter alone. You know, so as he calculates what his next step is, and God knows what that is, there are things that the United States is doing, and then there are market responses to that, you know, that I think are very, very important. I mean, this is what fundamentally is different. Never mind, we're not talking about nuclear weapons, which is also something that's different from the Cold War. But, you know, Russia's economy is far more integrated in the global system, you know, today than it was, you know, 50 years ago. And this does provide the United States and Europe important leverage. I think the president's been cautious because, let's be honest, ultimately the toughest decisions in this process as we raise costs are going to be done in Europe, you know, rather than the United States. But I think the president's giving Putin time, you know, and enough rope, you know, so that when he missteps or when he oversteps, that then you're increasing the political consensus behind a long-term challenge that's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, I think we can over time begin to see with the great work that Carlos Pascual is doing in the new Energy Bureau at the State Department. Ultimately, we have a very important energy card that we can play over time, you know, to help wean you know, Europe off of Russian energy and onto, you know, Western energy. That was something that we began to wrestle with in 2009. I think the Bush administration was focused on the issue even before the Obama administration, you know, came into office. So that's the long-term solution. And obviously, in the meantime, you've got to manage that. But I know the German government has begun to sell energy to you know, to Ukraine as just, you know, the beginning of an effort to kind of shift that you know, in a different direction. I mean, as much as it's about imposing costs on Putin, I think the other thing that the West needs to do is to redeem the choice that Ukraine has made to turn west rather than east. And this is a difficult environment, and one of the most important steps to take is a credible election to rebut the Russian narrative that the current interim government is illegitimate and a bunch of fascists. So having a good election in Ukraine will be very important, and it may calm, hopefully over time will calm some of the fears that have arisen in the eastern part of the country. But unfortunately, the longer this churns, on one, you don't have a climate that lends itself to an effective election, and secondly, the longer it churns, even if Putin does not have a grand design on Ukraine, it gives time for some of these actors, you know, some of whom might be under control of Russia, some of whom are not, and all of a sudden they do something that for which the various powers, the United States, Russia, and Europe, you know, cannot overcome. And all of a sudden now you've got a dynamic that nobody controls. That's the greatest danger the longer this goes on. But I do think in this particular case, you know, notwithstanding the criticism that, you know, the president's not strong enough, he's, you know Russia's a better, you know, Putin's a better leader and all that kind of nonsense. does anybody want to go to war in Crimea? You know, that's the reality is no. I think the president is making sure that rhetoric and actions and capabilities stay pretty much aligned. Obviously, you know, what we've seen from experiences in some cases, particularly in Syria, you know, our rhetoric has gotten, you know, pretty far advanced from what we're actually prepared to do.
Yes,
Thank you for your comments. You spoke about the increasing tendency over the last 20 years for national security policy, foreign policy, to be made at the White House. And but it
I don't think that was
strikes
a groundbreaking statement.
no, but it strikes me that the media is presenting it more and more as if there is a huge disconnect between the White House and the bureaucracies concerning foreign policy. And I'm wondering if you can speak to whether there is any interaction between the State Department, the NSC, as they develop policy, and whether there is any input there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a very rich level of interaction, and there's even far more. I mean, there was, I think, you know, fairly important and productive interaction. You know, in the 90s, I know, having served at the White House during the second term of the Clinton administration, I think the team at that point, Sandy Berger as National Security Advisor, Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State, Bill Cohen as Secretary of Defense, George Tenet as Director of Central Intelligence, that was a very effective team. They didn't see every issue the same way. They would challenge each other and test each other in terms of policy options, but they gave the president very good advice. The president followed that advice, and then, you know, I think there was great coordination in executing U.S. foreign policy at the time. When you think, I didn't serve in the Bush administration, from you know, the cheap seats, it was my impression that there was dysfunction in that process in the first term. You know, Condi Rice, as National Security Advisor, could not overcome the tensions, you know, between the Cheney-Rumsfeld axis on the one hand and the Rice-Powell axis on the other hand. It seemed the president was willing to make that, you know, kind of, you know, bridge that divide. Condi Rice came over here to the State Department. You know, Steve having moved up to be a very effective National Security Advisor. Bob Gates came in, you know, one of the great team players that you're ever going to encounter, and the second Bush term had a much better and more effective, you know, foreign policy coordination and execution than happened in the first term. I think that those lessons carried over into the Obama administration. I think the reality about the Obama administration is that there was a very intensive you know, policy process, and that continues, you know, to this day. You know, from Secretary Clinton to Jim Steinberg when he was Deputy National Security or Deputy Secretary of State, even Jack Lew as Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, they got pulled into, you know, 5 or 6 deputy committee meetings on a daily basis. You know, at some point, you know, a couple of my colleagues at the Assistant Secretary level were saying, if we have any more meetings, we won't be actually able to do what they told us to do. Because by the time we got out of a policy meeting, you know, in region X, Y, or Z, they'd gone to bed. But, you know, there is tremendous, you know, coordination. In a public diplomacy sense, I have daily interactions with my colleagues over at the NSC and others. I knew that whatever was in my book, when I went to the podium to brief, you know, the policy guys at Defense, the policy guys at NSC had also seen and strangled, in many cases, the language that I had in the book. In fact, one of my friends who was in charge of Western Hemisphere affairs, when he used to see the daily guidance, he'd call over and said, "Who's briefing today?" And if he found out it was me, he'd cut the guidance in half, saying, okay, he's going to exaggerate it anyway, so I might as well reduce it to a lower common denominator. Yeah, so I mean, but yeah, I think there is tremendous integration today. But the reality is that foreign policy is formulated ultimately now, I think, at the White House. I'm not saying that's wrong, and then it's executed at the State Department, quite effectively, in my view.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, sir. Yes, okay. Oh, okay. There's another one in the back. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Please go ahead, sir.
I think you can hear me. I don't need any mic. My question really is a question of the process and tactics used by the State Department spokesmen and spokespersons. You don't necessarily know what questions are going to be asked every day, but I imagine in general what you end up is answering the questions that you thought were going to be asked, and you don't have time for much more. So I guess my question really is, to what extent can the spokesperson's job be used more super actively, overactively, to bring up in the way of points you want to make a question that hasn't been asked yet? It seems to me that otherwise you tend to, even no matter how good you are, you tend to be defensive. You or whoever tend to be there to answer the questions you think are going to come up. And if they come up, you've done your job. To what extent can you and should you spend time dealing with questions that haven't been asked but are definitely high priority in the State Department and maybe in the White House too?
It's a great question. I tried to open a briefing by saying something. I mean, the question came up when I was there. The questions come up sometimes in our discussions at GW since. Does the United States State Department have to brief every day? And my view is, we're the United States of America. We have a global policy. We care about every square inch of the earth. We have an opinion about everything, and we ought to express that opinion. So I always thought that was a good idea, that in some fashion, either the spokesman or the secretary would be out every day and have something to say of importance regarding the crisis of the moment, or things that were on our radar but not necessarily on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times. I occasionally would try to introduce a topic that I knew would not be asked. It was in my book. It was good stuff. It reflected what the State Department was doing, but I knew it was not going to be asked. For example, I would try to introduce policy elements on Africa. There was not an African journalist in the room. At the State Department briefing room, it's interesting. There were 3 briefings going on at the same time. The first couple of rows were the U.S. journalists and producers and the wire services. In the middle were South Asian journalists and Middle Eastern journalists. And every once in a while, they collaborate. All of a sudden, you turn to Lalit or Goyal, and they'd ask a Middle East question and go, okay, what's going on here? And in the back, very patiently, were the Asian journalists who bided their time. They were always too courteous. I used to tease them. I said, ask me a question about North Korea. The policy on North Korea never changes. I have it committed to memory. I said the same thing in 2009. I was saying in 1999. We're going to step on 8 toes. So an interesting dynamic, but I always would try to find a way to introduce a subject that I knew was not going to be asked, but reflected good work being done at the State Department by somebody who didn't always get that kind of a headline. And in this environment, you know what? It would find, that information would find a niche, somewhere. I used to tweet out a lot of things, as a State Department spokesman. It drove some of the policy guys crazy. But if there was something in the book that was good stuff, but didn't get asked, if I could noodle it down to 140 characters, I would try to push something out. One day I pushed out a little bit of a nugget on Indonesia, and the Defense Department came back, and said, "Oh, you didn't tweet the guidance." And when I did, I absolutely tweeted the guidance. Every word I tweeted out was from the guidance. They said, "Yeah, but it's carefully crafted a certain line on Indonesia. It's this, but that, and I used this, but not that." And they said, "You lost the nuance." And I went, "There's no nuance in Twitter. It's 140 characters." But you look to find ways to bring out the State Department, as we all know, it's a remarkable agency. Dollar for dollar, the United States gets more out of the State Department than any other agency in government. Certainly the other agency with which I spent 11 years, or 26 years, depending on how you calculate it. There's wonderful work being done, and you have to find a way to bring that work out. So I drag some people down to the podium, and there might be 5 journalists there, but it asks a couple of questions, you get something on the record, and again, you ship it out in today's world, and it's going to find a home somewhere. So you try to find a way to push out things that are important, but not necessarily things that are going to make headlines. I try to do it all the time.
Last question, Todd.
I'm a retired U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service officer, now working for AFSA. And when I was working overseas, I always found USIS and public diplomacy as being the most critical element that we partnered with in order to present American products and services. For example, in Japan, using the very evocative American lifestyle and culture to sell products which otherwise people thought were schlock, or at least present them in a more attractive way. More recently, however, and I thought the cultural programs that public diplomacy did were just incredible. More recently, there has been a lot of concern about the mainstream American culture, the Sex and the City type culture, which is so overwhelming our cultural message that it is really undermining it and actually contributing to terrorism and issues like that, in the sense that people see our culture is decadent. And more recently, in a Senate hearing, Secretary Kerry was in talking about Benghazi. Senator Paul made reference to sending comedians to India. And of course, there was no context.
Idea, by the way.
There was no context that this may be part of a cultural engagement. And so I was just wondering on this newer issue for public diplomacy.
Well, you raise a lot. You raise a lot of issues there. Let me unpack a couple of those things. Boy, I think that any time that we can show the wonderful sense of humor that Americans have, this is a wonderful thing. I thought Senator Paul, was kind of off base with that. And conversely, you see the dynamic that emerged in Egypt with Bassem Youssef on the one hand, and the partnership that and the engagement that he had with Jon Stewart. That dynamic is what is actually happening across the Middle East. You read a great book by Robin Wright, Rock the Kasbah, and it's all about how music and entertainment have created a kind of an underground that is popping up, and you've got guys like General CC that's trying to do this, and it's a losing proposition. And so if we can make fun of ourselves, what kind of a role model is that? I think it's a wonderful idea that the United States has the ability to display a sense of humor. We should do it more often. I tried to use Twitter, with a sense of humor. In 2009, Chuck Todd at NBC said I had the tweet of the year. I beat out Sarah Palin and Snooki for the honor.
What was it?
The tweet was as soon as Jimmy Carter left North Korea. As President Clinton had gone in 2009, when Jimmy Carter went in either 2009, 2010, to bring out someone who was an American who was imprisoned in North Korea. And so I tweeted out, hey, you need to pay attention to State Department travel warnings. We're running out of ex-presidents. Yeah, so, you know, when one of the Kim family ended up in Singapore at a show, I said the family should get out more often. You know, so, and you know, you know, some people said, hey, that worked. You know, so I think that's a wonderful thing that we should. Yeah, that's what culture is all about. I mean, the other side of the coin is, and there's this delicate issue over in a freedom, and what happens when a government, you know, Turkey's the latest example, Jonathan, where it tries to turn off, you know, social media because there's something on YouTube that they don't like. You know, I mean, obviously we demonstrate by example that, you know, you're allowed to ignore it. You know, it's ultimately what tolerance is all about. If we practice it, then we can lead by example. You know, is that going to, you know, is Turkey going to go, yeah, we did, you know, over time they will, but obviously this is a process that is going to take some time. So I do think in the cultural area, sure, we have programs that they don't like. You know, by the same token, we have to have an open door on this side. You know, I mean, every once in a while we've had a controversial figure that has a university wants to bring them here, and we go, can't have that. You know, again, we have to lighten up. If we're going to have a vigorous debate about issues, then let's have that debate. We have to recognize, because we're now in a world in which there's no divide, you know, what we do, they see and hear. What they do, we see and hear. And to the extent we can foster this conversation, eventually we arrive at some sort of accommodation. A last comment that I'll make, one of the more remarkable points in Afghanistan in 2010, there was a military operation, and we arrested 2 Al Jazeera journalists. And I didn't know about it. Doug Wilson, my counterpart at Defense, didn't know about it. General Petraeus didn't know about it before it happened. And it turned out these were guys who were part of the Taliban embed process. You know, we have journalists that go with U.S. soldiers when they undertake an operation. Well, these were guys that were on the Taliban phone tree, and they would get calls that would say, hey, you know, if you set a camera up Tuesday night on this block, something might blow up. You know, and we arrested them because they were providing material support, you know, to the Taliban. Well, the day before this happened, I had been criticizing Russia, you know, for jailing, you know, yet another round of journalists. And so I'm going to Doug, and Doug going, I agree with you. And we're both talking to General Petraeus, and he's going, what the heck? You know, and that's the challenge. I mean, government's very big. You know, it's very transactional, and being able to look at a potential action and trying to connect it to something larger is hard. Or looking at an action and saying, okay, what if this becomes public? Can I explain it? If I can't explain it, don't do it. You know. Well, later on, the head of strategic communication for General Petraeus sat down with the Al Jazeera bureau chief, and he said, you know, here's what your guys were doing that caused us concern. And the Al Jazeera bureau chief said they were violating our guidelines on reporting. And so, you know, the moral of the story is, why don't we start there? You know, have that conversation first and say, you know, we've got a problem. Now, either you solve the problem or we'll solve the problem. You know, but doing it where and doing it where you're able to handle a situation with public diplomacy in mind before it pops into the open, before it becomes a crisis, or before it becomes a headline, you know, in an unflattering portrayal in this publication or that publication. That's the mindset that we have to have. And in a way, you know, I'm always an admirer of the Marines, even though I served in the Air Force. And you know, every Marine is a spokesman, you know, for that service. You know, and I think we have to have that same mentality across government. You know, that in today's world, whatever we're doing is going to become public, one way or another. And so we have to have a public dimension to what we're thinking, what we're doing, what we're communicating, and just try to figure out if in the process of doing that, we can narrow the gap between what we say and what we do.
Well, with that, let me thank you again.